All human beings are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain rights, which are inalienable, and they also include the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Leaving the decision of their intention to God, good people of the American colonies, by authority, declare that these united colonies are independent and sovereign states, and all allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain and all political ties with it are renounced. These historical words are the Declaration of Independence of the USA. This declaration with this word was issued on July 4th, 1776, at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The Declaration was drafted by a committee including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, and signed by 53 men of 13 USA colonies. The Declaration sped the war that started with a tragedy on a cold evening in 1777. Then a painting was created that made the fragmented American colonies into one nation. What happened that cold evening, and what was the story of this painting? Zod Abaid in History Speaks, History of America, Season 2, Episode 1, will show you all this. It's about March 1777, when snow was falling intermittently in Boston, the city of Massachusetts State. People's feelings were very warm in this cold snowfall, because the red-dressed British soldiers in the city, known as the Redcoats because of their clothing, had come on a mission. These Redcoats came to force taxes from the Americans because the people in the American colonies refused to pay taxes. The reason was that people throughout America, including Boston, were angry that Britain was taxing them but did not give them representation in the UK Parliament. They believed that Britain was actually robbing them. Therefore, Boston merchants started smuggling to avoid taxes. The people in the city had put up posters to boycott British products. People were so angry that they burned official documents of Great Britain, i.e. issued papers, official and legal papers, because they were also taxed. So there was an atmosphere of mob violence in the city. People had come to the extent of beating the sellers of British products. So the British authorities, in order to control the 16,000 populated city, Boston, called some 4,000 redcoats. So the redcoats had to crack down hard on tax evaders and the brawlers. On the other hand, the citizens also did not give a good welcome to these redcoats. So wherever they got a chance, they would shout at the redcoats and create a ruckus and vent as much anger as they could on the redcoats. So on the evening of March 5th, some angry Americans found a lonely redcoat. This lone British soldier was stationed outside the customs house. The Americans started abusing him and pelting him with snowballs. Just as this was going on, 8 more redcoats rushed to help him. The sight of more redcoats sent the already angry crowd into a frenzy. They started challenging the redcoats that if you have courage, shoot at them. Then suddenly a sound of fire echoed with a whiz. Why? How? Who did this fire? To this day, no one knows. It seems that this shot was fired by one of the redcoats, and its target was the American crowd. After the first shot, the guns of the rest of the redcoats also opened their mouths. Within moments, 5 Americans were lying dead on the ground, while 6 were nursing their wounds. Now, this mishap was just a tragedy, which happened at the instigation of the crowd. But this tragedy was immortalized by a painting. The painting was created by Boston artist Henry Pelham and depicts British soldiers firing on unarmed Americans. This painting somehow fell into the hands of a freedom fighter, Paul Revere. He designed this painting on wood, made its copies, and spread them around. On his copies was written Bloody Massacre. So the painting and news of this Boston tragedy appeared in American dailies and spread throughout the American colonies. This painting gave the formerly divided American colonies a common cause of resistance to Britain, and thus the American colonies began to coalesce into one nation. On the other, the British started trying hard to appease the angry Americans. Soldiers who fired on innocent civilians in Boston were arrested and tried. Interestingly, these soldiers were defended by the American lawyer John Adams, who later fought for freedom against Britain and became the U.S. president. John Adams proved these soldiers innocent in the court and released them. After this trial, the British abolished all taxes on American colonies, except for tea. But Americans continued to boycott British products, and the damage came to a company on which its mark was deep in history. This company was the East India Company. The East India Company which was busy gradually occupying India these days, also exported tea to the American colonies. But when the tea was taxed, the Americans boycotted the company's tea and started drinking tea smuggled from the Dutch companies. Because of this smuggling, the East India Company's tea exports stopped, and tons of tea leaves started rotting in its warehouses. What the British Parliament, to drive East India Company from losses, passed the Tea Act in 1773. Under this act, the full rights to sell tea in the American colonies were given to only one company, the East India Company. Additional tax levied on the company in UK was also waived. The Americans who were buying tea from this company for selling to the colonies did not get the waiver of tax from Britain. So again, its reaction was intense and immediate. Boston merchants formed a secret organization called the Sons of Liberty. On the night of December 16th, 1773, dozens of members of this organization boarded 3 ships docked at Boston Harbor. These ships were loaded with East India Company tea. The attackers were dressed like Native Americans and were carrying the famous Native American axes known as tomahawks. So with the same axes, they tore open 248 boxes of tea, and from them 45 tons of tea, valued $1 million in today's currency, were drowned in the sea. This event is remembered in history as the Boston Tea Party, which meant a tea party held in Boston. In response to it, the British government closed the port of Boston to trade and imposed more stringent laws in America. Britain wanted to recover the cost of this tea from the Americans, but it could not. Rather, an incident took place 3 months later. In March 1774, once again the citizens of Boston attacked a ship and threw 30 boxes full of tea into the water. When the news of this new incident spread, the other American colonies, Maryland, New York, and South Carolina, also picked up this idea. They also got on the ships of the East India Company and disposed of tea to sea. Now the whole of America was becoming united against Great Britain. A wave of revolution and freedom had begun, but it needed a political leadership, which it got from the Congress, which had representatives of all the 13 American colonies. These 2 buildings, close to each other, are in the American city of Philadelphia. These closely located buildings are very valuable historically. The first building is Carpenter's Hall, and the second is Independence Hall. When America was through Independence Way, the representatives of its colonies would gather in these 2 buildings to discuss the situation. A month after the Declaration of Independence, in late August, more than 30,000 British troops attacked New York. A fleet of 400 ships of the British Navy, equipped with heavy guns, took part in this battle and was shelling the Americans with their powerful guns. The huge firepower of the British Navy and Army overwhelmed the Americans soon. By September 15th, the British captured New York City, New York State. The capture took place, but George Washington retreated at the right time to save his army from encirclement and also save the lives of a large number of their soldiers. Now, the British had a chance to launch a major attack and crush the American rebellion once and for all. This attack was planned by the British from the Canadian side because the British forces here were very strong, and this first attack from Canada was to be done on the state of New York because the capital of this state, New York City, was under the control of the British. However, the rest of the state was occupied by the Americans. The plan of the British was to capture the rest of New York State and restore the land connection with New York City, because New York City was a peninsula as the map shows. The second advantage to the British was the division of American states into 2, which had to give the British a strong military benefit. So, according to this plan, in June 1777, British General John Burgoyne attacked the state of New York with 9,000 soldiers. His target was the city of Albany, New York, and the capture of the city meant that the British Army would soon regain land links with New York City and cut off all of New England from the rest of the U.S. back into British control. New England was the hub of the American War of Independence. Boston, where the fight for freedom began, it was also in New England. The capture of New England meant the end of the American Revolutionary War. Defeating General Burgoyne became a matter of life and death for the Americans. So thousands of American soldiers reached this front. Here, they spread out into the jungle and started fighting in guerrilla style. American snipers took cover behind trees and began to escape after targeting the British officers and their native guides. In this battle, the British lost so many lives that they lost spirit when reached Saratoga, 40-50 kilometers away from El Bain. The British took refuge in an agricultural farm in Saratoga and took a defensive position by putting up fences around it. But here the Americans started to get an edge as they surrounded the British soldiers who had taken a defensive position. About 20,000 Americans surrounded them near Saratoga. Now, they began attacks on the British. The British did their best to break the circle of the Americans, but failed. Terse scum and exhausted, General Burgoyne on October 17, 1777, with 5,000 British troops, surrendered before American General Gates. The defeat of the British was a turning point in America's War of Independence. Impressed by the U.S. success, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, enemies of Britain as they've been defeated by in the past, also waged a war against Britain. They fought the British Army inside and outside the United States. Along with this, their experienced soldiers also helped the American Army. They helped Washington and his army in Valley Forge, where they were in the winter. In the winter of 1777, George Washington, with 10,000 troops, came to Valley Forge in the U.S. state of Pennsylvania for rest, because war was not possible in snowfall. But when it started snowing, life here became miserable for his army. 2,500 American soldiers died from cold, hunger, and disease. But despite all, the Americans at Valley Forge also received great help. Here the French General Marcus Laffitte and a former German military officer, Steuben, trained him to international standards. So at the end of winter, the American army fighting hunger and disease here turned out to be a formidable modern fighting force. After that, for the next 4 years, the war had ups and downs. George Washington attempted to encircle a large British army in the same way. General Burgoyne's army in Saratoga had been encircled by American forces. And then, in September 1781, the English commander, General Lord Cornwallis, was surrounded at Yorktown, Virginia. He had more than 7,000 British troops and a large number of weapons. He was the same Lord Cornwallis who came to India and fought Tipu Sultan and inflicted on him first defeat. So in 1781, Lord Cornwallis was trapped in Yorktown. George Washington, with more than 20,000 American and French troops, encircled Yorktown and began bombarding it. General Cornwallis had only one way of escape, and that was by sea, because it was from here that the ships of the British Navy could come to his aid. But on September 5th, the French naval force defeated the British near Yorktown and cut the supply line. The American army also heavily attacked the British positions outside Yorktown. Within days, Lord Cornwallis was disappointed. On October 17th, Lord Cornwallis messaged George Washington for surrender. The formal surrender ceremony was held 2 days later on October 19th. Cornwallis did not come and send a subordinate, General Charles with sword, to meet the formalities of surrender. When the formality of the surrender was completed, it was declared that Americans had decisively won against the British, so no check to their freedom. After the defeat of Yorktown, the British gave up war and adopted negotiations. In 1782, negotiations began in France, in which Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay represented the U.S. Congress. Britain initially wanted to end the war without granting independence to America or accept its declaration of independence. Americans were not ready to end the war unless their independence was accepted. But after months of long negotiations, the Americans won, and Britain agreed to recognize America's independence. On September 3rd, 1783, the historic treaty was signed in Paris, under which America became an independent country. The most important point of this agreement was that the territories which Britain had taken from France in 1763 were also handed over to the United States by Britain. They included land in present-day Ohio, Michigan, and several other states. Apart from these territories to the USA, the British also returned Florida to Spain. Thus, the sun of the British Empire set in the United States of America forever. After the Treaty of Paris, the British also evacuated New York City. On November 25, 1783, Washington entered New York City as a victor. For years after the Paris Treaty, The U.S. Constitution was completed in 1787. Under the Constitution, the first U.S. presidential election was held in 1789, and George Washington, the hero of independence, was elected president. John Adams, who saved the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre, became the first vice president of the United States. The America that George Washington found was almost half of today's America. So, how did the U.S. become a vast country of 50 states? Why was America at war with Great Britain even after its independence? What happened to the millions of Native Americans living in America? Is America a stolen country? All of this will be shown to you in the next episode of History of America. If you haven't watched History of America Season 1 yet, at night, the banks of the Ohio River roared with water, and a nearby log cabin, a Native American mother waiting for her baby to arrive. It was the year 1768, and the stars were twinkling in the clear sky. When this mother gave birth to her child at some time of the night, her eyes were on the sky. The mother saw a star break from the sky and disappear somewhere behind the distant Apocalypse Mountains. In her Shawnee tribe, the falling star was called Tecumseh. This scene was so fascinating that the mother also named the child Tecumseh. This was a child who had to fight for an independent country for his people. If Canada is not a part of America today, this child has a very important role in it. What is the story of this baby and the new country of the United States of America? What was the battle wherein the American flag was bombed all night but did not fall? But why? Why was America to fight another war for independence? I am Zada Abaid, and in this episode of History Speaks, History of America, I will show you all this America comprised of mapped 13 states when it gained independence in 1776. Then by 1783, this area, which extends to present-day U.S. state of Wisconsin, was also included in the United States. But between these early 13 states and the vast America that spread westward was the Apocalypse Mountains, a range thousands of kilometers long. At that time, this area was called Northwest. Today, it is called the Old Northwest. These magical landscapes and eye-popping lakes that you see are part of the same Northwest. So this region in the new country, USA, was separated by this mountain range. Accessing the Northwest from these 13 states was not easy. Only a small number of Americans made it through the difficult mountain passes. But then the Americans soon found a place far down in the South that could easily reach the Northwest bypassing the Appalachian Mountains. As you can see on the map, this route passed through the present-day American coastal city of New Orleans. American or white settlers would go to New Orleans, and from here, travel up the Mississippi River, would easily reach upper Northwest or around. For this reason, the number of Americans in the Northwest began to increase rapidly. But to all the Americans who were settling here in the Northwest, for them the maritime trade for other significant purposes, these 13 states across the Appalachian Mountains were of great importance. Rather, these states were also their main supply line. That's why the importance of the area of New Orleans connecting these two parts can be well understood. But the problem was that the Americans were using this route. But this area was not part of the United States until 1803. The area was under French control, and France was ruled by a powerful commander like Napoleon Bonaparte. It was feared that this area of strategic importance was closed off by Napoleon. A vital supply line between the two sides of America would be cut off. So, to save it, the Americans made a historic deal with France. This deal was the largest in U.S. history in terms of areas which it had without a war. In 1803, the U.S. bought from France the Northwest area, including New Orleans, which is historically called Louisiana Territory. And do you know how much it was bought for? For only $11.2 million. For 2.1 million square kilometers, for only $11.2 million. The annexation of this territory to the U.S. yielded two benefits to America. On the one hand, the area of this new country has doubled, and on the other, supply line to America from the Northwest was secured. Now, with New Orleans joining the United States, American settlers began to reach the Northwest easily through New Orleans. But here already lived Native American tribes, indigenous peoples who numbered in the millions, and they lived here for thousands of years, and this land was their home. Keep in mind that when France, Great Britain, or America would take any land from each other, the natives or the local tribes had no role in it. The USA, British or French, which took over the land, were to deal with these tribes. It was up to them to let them stay there or not, or expel, or kill them, or enslave them. So the Americans are the same in the Northwest. What they did elsewhere by dint of their cleverness or force of arms. That is, they began to take away lands from the natives cleverly and evict them. Even in 1809, the 12,000 square kilometers area was taken away from the natives by the Americans under the Fort Wayne Treaty. The area was below Lake Michigan, where now are Illinois and Indiana. Fort Wayne was a treaty that convinced the tribal youth that they were now enslaved by the white settlers. This sense of enslavement gave rise to a rage, and the rage was inflamed when a hero of the natives, Tecumseh, led it. Tecumseh was a chief of the Shawnee tribe of the Northwest. His tribe settled in what are now the U.S. states of Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Tecumseh strongly opposed the Fort Wayne Treaty. The governor of Indiana, William Harrison, met Tecumseh a couple of times in a bid to convince him not to oppose the treaty because the lands it covered were outside of his Shawnee tribe, and that those native tribes were mostly in favor of a treaty with the Americans. Despite these arguments, Tecumseh did not agree. Rather, according to legend, he once during the talks with William Harrison, he took out and raised his axe in anger, at which William also took out his sword. However, there was no fight, and the matter was sorted out amicably. It was true the Shawnee tribe of Tecumseh was not involved in the Fort Wayne Treaty, but Tecumseh considered all the local tribes as one nation. He believed that the whites would gradually deal with all the native tribes separately and would eventually take over all their land one day. As it was happening, therefore he united all tribes in the Northwest and was struggling for a homeland for the native people. He wanted to create an independent country for the natives in the Northwest, now known as the Great Lakes area. This part falls between Canada and the United States. In his struggle, Tecumseh was joined by his brother, a religious leader of the tribe. His brother Lalawethika called himself the prophet. He had frequent fits and would become drowsy or sometimes collapse sitting. On getting up, he would say the Holy Spirits ruling the world had sent him a message. He once said that the spirits had asked him that white Americans were the scourge of nature on the natives because the natives have left their culture and adopted the ways of the white people, and the spirits do not like this at all. He would also give a message from the spirits that if the natives unite, the whites will be wiped out from the Northwest, and then the native tribes will be able to live freely on their land in their own way. Under this campaign, he was uniting all the tribes of the Northwest. Tecumseh and his brother Lalawethika lived in Prophet's Town, the headquarters of the Shawnee tribe, which got its name from Lalawethika's claim to prophethood against the Americans, these two brothers, and this tribe got full support from Britain. You may ask that Britain had given up its hold on America years ago. Britain was still maintaining its pressure on America as a superpower. This pressure was from both the East and the West of America. In the East, where the Atlantic Ocean is, the British warships used to attack American merchant ships and rob and kidnap their crews. Britain would force America to completely stop trade with its enemy countries like France, etc. When America refused to accept British dictation, British fleets would blockade maritime routes for America. All this was done by Britain in the Atlantic Ocean to the east of the 13 colonies, while to the west of these colonies, across the Apocalypse Mountains, Great Britain was also continuously interfering. Britain was arming the native tribes so that they could continue to fight the American forces, and the U.S. at no point could not invade Canada, which was then under British control. That is why Britain armed them in Tecumseh's mission for independence. In return, Tecumseh's forces helped British forces against the U.S. to save Canada. Thus, Britain had gripped the U.S. from the sea in the east and the northwest region. In the west, that is, from both sides. 13 colonies of America did not feel free due to pressure and interference of Britain. Many in America believed that if they wanted true independence from Britain, they would have to fight another decisive war with Britain. Then, unexpectedly, the Second War of American Independence started early And one of the immediate reasons for this was the same broken star. Tecumseh, for the sake of ousting Americans from his territory, was preparing for a decisive war with the help of Britain. Then the Americans made a surprise attack, and in 1811 the war began. The American intellectuals had been expecting over the long time, and this war is called America's Second War of Independence. Governor William Harrison of Indiana, who later became the American president, marched on Tecumseh's headquarters at Prophetstown with 1,100 soldiers. Tecumseh was not there at that time. His younger brother Lauwithika fought the Americans with 600 warriors, but was defeated and escaped to Canada, where his ally the British ruled. William's army set fire to Prophetstown after looting it. During the looting and search, a bombshell of a vital secret fell on the Americans. So when Americans searched Prophetstown, they found many British weapons. That is, now the evidence was found that Britain is fully supporting the native tribes against the United States. This news spread like wildfire. The American press created an uproar that Britain should be retaliated. Many hardliners in America were already talking about war with Britain. This incident gave more strength to his position. The next year, i.e. in 1812, the American Congress declared war against Britain. The most important target of the United States in this war was not to defeat Tecumseh, but its target was to capture the territory of Canada to defeat Britain decisively, because Canada was a British colony at that time. This move of the Americans was very powerful and timely, as the British army was then at war with the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Therefore, the British army could not pay much attention to the Canadian front. With this weak moment in mind, the Americans repeatedly launched attacks on British forces in Canada. But surprisingly, the lesser British army pushed the Americans back every time. With the British forces, Tecumseh's forces were also involved in rescuing Canada, because after the destruction of his capital, Prophetstown, he publicly joined hands with the British and also declared war against America against its new colonies. Tecumseh, along with the British, defeated the American forces on several fronts and captured one of their key territories, Detroit. Tecumseh was a headache for the Americans on several fronts. Americans were quite upset by his attacks and his heroic personality. He had become a role model of bravery and independence for the native youth. Stories of his bravery and kindness were widely exaggerated among the tribes. Now America wanted to eliminate Tecumseh, a symbolic leader, at every cost. But many times he escaped even after being hit by their bullets. In 1813, Tecumseh was in a fort near Detroit in the area held by the Americans. Here he learned his old enemy, William Harrison, who set fire to Prophetstown, was approaching an army of 3,500 men. Tecumseh had 600 to 700 native fighters and an equal number of Britishers to fight. It was an army of a total of 1,300/1,400 men, which was less than half of the army of the U.S. commander William Harrison. In this condition, it was impossible to fight the Americans. Therefore, the British Army and their native allies, the soldiers of Tecumseh, evacuated Detroit and its nearby forts and retreated towards Canada to the banks of the Thames River. But William Harrison was a shrewd commander. He wanted to end the threat forever. He did not give up the pursuit of Tecumseh and the British soldiers. Pursuing them, in a few days he reached the banks of the Thames, where Tecumseh and his English allies were encamped. When Tecumseh and the British saw no other option, they set out to fight. On October 5, 1813, the two armies clashed near the River Thames. The British were beaten and fled after a strong attack from the Americans. But Tecumseh and his warriors, knowing that it was a losing battle, continued to fight resolutely against the Americans. They did not accept surrender, not to let his generations face the shame of it. Tecumseh was also a poet. He said in his revolutionary poems, "I sing the song of my death and die like a hero returning home." So in this battle, a single bullet showed this hero the way home. The tomahawk, a symbol of the resistance of the native tribes, was in his hand. When the bullet sang his death and a dreamer for having land for his people, a hero in the struggle for a separate homeland, was gone. After the battle, native fighters buried Tecumseh somewhere on the river bank. The Battle of the River Thames was a decisive battle in American history. America had now won it. With Tecumseh's death, the resistance of natives in the Northwest ended forever. No one was there to challenge the United States. British forces made a massive symbolic attack on the Americans the next year. They captured the White House. In mid-1814, a British fleet was on its way to attack the U.S. coastal city of Baltimore. Baltimore was the port from where the U.S. ships used to attack British ships. Baltimore was the port from where the U.S. ships used to attack British ships. This fleet, for unknown reasons, changed its course and attacked Washington. British Marine forces landed in Maryland and began advancing toward Washington. The American soldiers tried hard to stop them, resisted them, but the British Army continuously pushed them back and reached the capital, Washington, D.C. on August 23rd. A day before the British Army arrived in the capital, American President James Madison went outside Washington to assess the situation on the battlefield, but he did not get the chance to return, and after receiving the news of the British advance, he saw fit to flee to Virginia in the chaos. Now in the White House, then called the Executive Mansion, his wife, Dolly Madison, was waiting for him. During this wait, Dolly would often stand in a window of the White House and look out over the city through binoculars. She did not see her husband, but she saw a group of British soldiers at some distance from the city. Dolly realized the danger and immediately ordered his servants to pack up the official files in the White House and leave the city with her. But along with this command, she also gave another strange command. She said the portrait of George Washington installed in the White House should be taken down and hidden in a safe place. Dolly Madison did not want the portrait of the hero of the U.S. War of Independence, George Washington, should go to the British Army for bad treatment. So, on her orders, the painting of George Washington was taken out of the frame and hidden in an outside farmhouse where painting remained safe for weeks. It was returned to the White House when the situation improved. George Washington's painting is installed in the East Room of the White House. It goes in at the same painting that Dolly Madison saved at that time. After saving this portrait, Dolly also left the city with his servants and reached her husband in Virginia. When the British Army entered Washington on August 24th after the escape of Dolly, the city was deserted. All citizens and the American soldiers had left the city the day before. British troops entered Washington and attacked the U.S. Capitol, the place where the U.S. government offices are located. In those days, the U.S. Capitol was still under construction and not completed. The British set this unfinished U.S. Capitol on fire. British soldiers then entered the White House, where they ate from the U.S. president's dishes and looted the entire building. British Commander Admiral Cockburn took the U.S. president's hat and a chair cushion of the First Lady as souvenirs. The British soldiers opened the White House windows and gathered on the lawn. They lit torches and threw them in through the open windows of the White House. The White House burned and black smoke rose towards the sky with the flames. It is said that the flames of the fire in the White House were visible from miles away. By burning official buildings in Washington, D.C., the British actually took revenge on the Americans because they had also burned York, now Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada, a year earlier. So, as Toronto and the capital of Tecumseh, Prophetstown, were burned, the same story was repeated by nature with the American capital as well. After Washington, the British Legion had the most important battle in U.S. history that gave birth to the American national anthem. How was that war? After burning the government buildings in Washington, D.C., the British Army evacuated the city, boarded their ships, and headed for their original target, Baltimore. Here a bigger challenge awaited them. Occupying Baltimore was not as simple as burning the White House. This was due to the fact the city was at a great depth far back from the coast, and the coastal land extended far on either side of it. The city could be attacked from two places only, one from the port side facing the front, and the other from the land route that bypassed the port to the city. The Americans had made full arrangements to secure these two routes. The passage to the port was also very narrow. At the edge of this narrow passage, the Americans had built a big fort called Fort McHenry, and cannons were installed on it. In order to secure the land route after the port, the American soldiers and the people had made fronts by collecting mud and artillery behind them. So these days, both land and sea routes were fully secured by the Americans. When the British fleet reached Baltimore, the British commanders, instead of attacking by sea, decided to proceed by land. The bid failed badly as British Commander General Ross was killed therein. The command of the British Army came to Commander Colonel Arthur Brooke. But the war could not proceed from here. On the land front, there was a stalemate. The British fleet then advanced and began shelling Fort McHenry, which was guarding the harbor. If this fort was conquered, the British Army could easily enter the harbor and capture Baltimore, its goal. The night of September 13th and 14th passed as a doomsday at Fort McHenry. Hundreds of shells from the British fleet fell around the fort and into the sea. Their blasting presented the scene of a firework in the sky. Amid the fireworks, the Star-Spangled American flag was flying over the fort. Francis Scott Key, a Maryland lawyer, watched the scene from a ship near shore. He took out a pen and paper and wrote an American song, later known as the Star-Spangled Banner. That is a flag adorned with stars. No bomb could drop this flag that flew till morning when the bombardment ended. On the morning of September 14th, the British had lost the spirit. Despite such a heavy bombardment, they failed to capture Fort McHenry. They recalled all troops and left Baltimore. The retreat of the British fleet from Baltimore was a grand victory for the USA. This victory made the poem Star-Spangled Banner so popular that in 1931 this poem became the American national anthem. Although the United States was victorious in Baltimore, but in the 2-year war from 1812 to 1814, both the gain from both Britain and the United States was nothing. Britain had successfully defended Canada, and America had saved its important territories from the British. The British captured many areas of the U.S. state of Maine on the Canadian border. However, these areas did not have significant strategic importance. So now, both countries decided to end this feudal war. On December 24th, 1814, a peace treaty was signed in Ghent, Belgium. It was agreed the countries would return areas taken away from each other. America did not get any new land from this war, but it definitely got the benefit of complete freedom from British pressure. Britain stopped attacks on U.S. merchant ships and ended military aid to native tribes in the Northwest. That is why Americans remembered this war as their second war of independence. Great Britain stopped interfering in America, but nothing was done to protect the native tribes in the peace treaty. They were left at the mercy of the conquering Americans. Then it happened that in 1830, U.S. President Andrew Jackson, for removing the native tribes from their lands, passed a law called the Indian Removal Act. This act removed thousands of Native Americans from their homelands and sent to Indian reservations hundreds of kilometers away. When the United States declared independence in 1776, its flag had only 13 stars. These stars represented its 13 states. But almost 250 years after its independence, when the United States hoisted its flag on the moon, it had 50 stars. How did these 50 stars become part of the American flag? And what was the Monroe Doctrine that made America a superpower? I am Faisal Warh, and you are watching History Speaks History of America Season 02, Episode 03. In this episode, we will show you the story of America's expansion. In 1814, the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain ended. The American nation considers this war its second war of independence. Now, the United States had entered a new era. The U.S. was transforming. The other countries in the region were also changing. North and South America were also transforming politically and geographically. In this changing world, the United States was trying to determine a new role for itself. It wanted to be a regional policeman. It all began in the 1820s. It affected the entire region from Mexico to Argentina, known as Latin America. Spain and Portugal previously controlled this region. But in the 1820s, these countries became independent. It was a great revolution, because for the first time, the European powers had lost influence in the region. Still, there was a problem. The European powers could still reoccupy these countries, because the newly independent countries were weak. Those countries were not politically stable either. Now the U.S. decided that it would protect these countries. It decided to counter any future European aggression in the region. The U.S. government announced this policy as Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine was issued 2 years after the independence of Mexico. President James Monroe issued a policy statement on the 2nd of December, 1823. It was a foreign policy statement for the U.S. Congress. This statement was called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had 4 points. First point, America would not allow European powers to occupy lands in North or South America. Second point, if a European power attacked a country in a region, the United States would consider it an attack against America. Third point, the U.S. will remain neutral in European conflicts. Fourth point, the U.S. would not intervene in the remaining European colonies in the Americas. Note, European powers still had some colonies in the region. So, these were the 4 points of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was an important step towards making America a superpower. This doctrine had given America an important role in the region. The Monroe Doctrine was a result of the political changes in Latin America. This doctrine helped America become a superpower. But only policy statements don't make a country superpower. A country needs strong manpower and intelligent leadership to become a superpower. Large area, natural resources, vast maritime territory, strong economy, and a powerful army are the 5 pillars of a superpower. But America's resources were still not enough. America's lack of power made Monroe Doctrine unimportant. America was a much smaller country at that time. Only 13 colonies in Louisiana Territory were part of the U.S. The American territory ended in Montana and Wyoming states. Oregon Country or Oregon Territory lay west of America. It was a disputed area. The U.S. and the U.K. jointly controlled it. This area was not yet officially part of any country. The area beyond Louisiana and Oklahoma in the southwest of the United States to Texas, and from there to California, was not under U.S. control. This area was part of Mexico. California and Oregon territories blocked the U.S. access to the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, the United States had a limited maritime territory. America was connected only to the Atlantic Ocean through its east coast. In addition, it bought Florida from Spain in 1819. The Florida Purchase expanded America's maritime and land territory, but it did not get the Texas coast. The Texas coast was still part of Mexico, so America's maritime and land territories were not enough. In addition, America did not have a strong military. In the 1820s, the United States had a small regular army. In fact, it had no proper standing army. America had only 10,000 to 15,000 regular soldiers at that time. These soldiers only defended important forts and cities. States had their own militias. When any war started, the states provided volunteers for the army. The states did not want a large American army. These states had so much political authority. They did not want the federal government to keep a large army. In addition, the U.S. did not have enough resources, so it could not afford a powerful army. The U.S. had not powerful navy either. It had no naval fleets or patrolling ships. Now the U.S. government decided to expand its military power. Because it could not become a great power with limited resources, the U.S. government realized they needed more land and resources to build a large army and naval fleets. The government wanted to create a powerful economy to maintain a professional regular force. The American leaders were also considering another option. They wanted to get access to the Pacific Ocean in the West. They knew if they got access to the Pacific Ocean, they would greatly increase their maritime territory. So they increased their efforts to reach the Pacific Ocean. But it was not an easy task. We have already shown you that America did not control Oregon Territory in California, so its access to the Pacific Ocean was difficult. So now the United States faced 2 challenges. The first challenge was to control California, and second to control Oregon Territory. America was soon successful in the first challenge. First of all, it got the entire territory of Texas without any war or bargaining. Actually, Mexico made a mistake that made the success possible. Texas was a large region when Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821. Texas became part of Mexico after independence. For other states of America were also part of Texas at that time, but Texas had only a small population. Mexico invited white people from America to live in Texas. Americans settled in Texas, and within few years their population was larger than the local Mexican population. These American people also had disputes with the Mexican government. Slavery was the major reason behind these disputes. Mexico banned slavery after independence, but the American people in Texas supported slavery because they needed slaves for their farms. So they rebelled against the Mexican government. The Americans declared the independence of Texas in 1836. The Mexican army attacked the Americans but could not retake its land. Texas became a free state. So the Mexican decision to invite the American people to Texas proved a mistake. This mistake destroyed the unity of Mexico forever. Now the Americans were ruling over Texas. These were the same people who had come from America to Texas. But now these people wanted to join their motherland, the United States. They asked the U.S. government to include Texas in the United States. But the U.S. government did not want to include Texas in the Union because of some political issues. One of the major political issues was slavery. Slavery was causing controversy. Many northern states had abolished slavery, but slavery was still legal in the southern states. Many U.S. politicians were against slavery. They did not want to include Texas in the U.S. because slavery was still legal in Texas. But Mexico rejected this offer because it did not want to sell its land. It refused to sell even an inch of its land. The U.S. president then decided to take the land by force. But it was not easy to start a war with Mexico. America needed an excuse to start a war. It wanted to prove that it was not starting a war to occupy the land. It wanted to show that the Americans were fighting for justice. Now, the U.S. president sent troops across River Nueces. These troops patrolled in the disputed territory. The U.S. military also built a fortress near Brownsville at the Mexican border. The U.S. troops began patrolling the disputed area. Mexico also responded with force to this American aggression. It also sent troops to the disputed area. The American and Mexican troops clashed on April 25, 1846. 14 American soldiers died in the fighting. The clash gave the U.S. president the excuse he wanted. He declared before the U.S. Congress that Mexico had invaded the American territory. He blamed that the Mexican troops had shed American blood on American soil. He asked Congress to declare war on Mexico. Congress agreed with the president and declared war on Mexico. Thus a war began between Mexico and the United States. The U.S. military entered Mexico from various locations. A portion of the U.S. military entered western Mexico and advanced toward California. Another force advanced into Mexico from Texas. The U.S. Navy launched an attack on Mexico from New Orleans. All three attacks were successful, and the Mexican army was defeated everywhere. The United States occupied entire western Mexico up to California. It also occupied many areas which are now part of present-day Mexico. The U.S. naval fleet was also successful in Mexico. It attacked the Mexican port of Veracruz. The U.S. forces landed in Veracruz. Then they advanced towards the Mexican capital, Mexico City. In September 1847, a fierce battle broke out between the Americans and the Mexican troops to control a fort outside the city. Defending the castle is a memorable event in Mexican history. 5 young Mexican cadets fought the Americans to the end. They sacrificed their lives for their country. A 6th military cadet saw the Americans entering the fort. He wrapped the Mexican flag around his body and jumped down from the fort wall. He did this to protect his country's flag from the U.S. invaders. Today, these 6 military cadets are called the Children Heroes. When these cadets died, the Americans occupied the fort. When the Mexican forces in Mexico City heard the news, they evacuated the city. When the Mexican army retreated, the Americans waved their flag over Mexico City. When the U.S. troops occupied Mexico City, the Mexicans decided to end the war. They began talks for a ceasefire. On February 2, 1848, both countries signed a ceasefire deal. Mexico recognized Texas as part of the United States. It also gave more land to the United States. Mexico surrendered 1.3 million square kilometers of more area to the United States. But in this war, the Americans got another success that they had been waiting for since their independence. The United States got control of California. It meant they had now reached the shores of the Pacific Ocean. This was a journey of more than 4,000 kilometers from the East Coast to the West Coast. The United States had covered this distance within 72 years of its independence. The dream to make America a great power had finally come true. The United States now had access to 2 oceans. These oceans gave the United States access to 3 continents. Through the Atlantic Ocean in the east, the United States came closer to Europe and Africa, while through the Pacific Ocean in the west, it could easily reach Asia, China, and Japan. Interestingly, the United States gained land access to the Pacific Ocean not only from California, but also from the Oregon Country. In 1846, America signed a deal with Great Britain on the status of the Oregon Country. This deal ended the joint U.S.-British control over Oregon Territory. This area became part of the United States. From the current state of Washington to California, the entire Pacific coast was now part of the United States. Britain and Mexico had relinquished their claims over the coast. Ironically, after the annexation of Mexico, the United States paid $15 million to Mexico. America's first offer to Mexico for this territory was $30 million. But obviously, after the war, Mexico was not in a position to demand more money because it had lost the war. The United States returned some territory to Mexico, including its capital, Mexico City, but deprived Mexico of its 1/3 territory on gunpoint. Now a smaller Mexico was not a problem for the U.S. anymore. This was the successful planning of the American leaders. This planning helped the United States become a superpower. When Mexico was surrendering California to the United States for $15 million only, a carpenter, James Marshall, found $2 billion from a river in California. How did he do that? Look carefully at this wheel and planks. This is the place where the carpenter James was standing. The site was originally a wooden workshop or a sawmill. This sawmill was operated with the force of water. James worked at this mill. On January 24th, 1848, James saw something shining in the river. He noticed there were small particles of gold that were scattered in the water. The news spread like wildfire from coast to coast in the United States. Millions of people from all over the United States moved to California to find gold. Everyone wanted gold. This period is called the Gold Rush in American history. At least 300,000 people from different parts of the United States settled in California during this period. The California Gold Rush lasted for at least 7 or 8 years. $2 billion worth of gold was mined from rivers. It looks that nature was also helping the U.S. in becoming a superpower because this wealth supported the American economy. Now the U.S. could easily afford a large and powerful military force. Now the U.S. had taken California and Oregon Territory. It had also reached the Pacific Ocean, but the American expansion did not stop on its western coast. Now the U.S. government planned to buy Alaska in western Canada. The area was at that time a Russian colony with a limited population. America had a solid reason to buy Alaska. Russia wanted to sell Alaska because it was worthless for it. The United States feared that Britain might buy the area. You have already known about the Monroe Doctrine. According to the doctrine, the United States did not want the European powers to get new lands in North and South America. So the U.S. government did not give the British any chance to buy Alaska. It offered to buy Alaska and make it part of the U.S. territory. The U.S. had already become a rich nation because of the gold rush. So a deal was signed in 1867. The U.S. paid Russia $7.2 million. Alaska's 1.5 square kilometers area became part of the United States under this deal. When Alaska joined the United States, the country's boundaries were now touching Asia, because only Bering Strait divided it from Asia. This was the same strait that had provided a land route to the first migrants from Asia to America. So now the U.S. borders had extended to the farthest corner of North America. But Mexico rejected this offer because it did not want to sell its land. It refused to sell even an inch of its land. The U.S. president then decided to take the land by force. But it was not easy to start a war with Mexico. America needed an excuse to start a war. It wanted to prove that it was not starting a war to occupy the land. It wanted to show that the Americans were fighting for justice. Now, the U.S. president sent troops across River Nueces. These troops patrolled in the disputed territory. The U.S. military also built a fortress near Brownsville at the Mexican border. The U.S. troops began patrolling the disputed area. Mexico also responded with force to this American aggression. It also sent troops to the disputed area. The American and Mexican troops clashed on April 25, 1846. 14 American soldiers died in the fighting. The clash gave the U.S. president the excuse he wanted. He declared before the U.S. Congress that Mexico had invaded the American territory. He blamed that the Mexican troops had shed American blood on American soil. He asked Congress to declare war on Mexico. Congress agreed with the president and declared war on Mexico. Thus a war began between Mexico and the United States. The U.S. military entered Mexico from various locations. A portion of the U.S. military entered western Mexico and advanced toward California. Another force advanced into Mexico from Texas. The U.S. Navy launched an attack on Mexico from New Orleans. All three attacks were successful, and the Mexican army was defeated everywhere. The United States occupied entire western Mexico up to California. It also occupied many areas which are now part of present-day Mexico. The U.S. naval fleet was also successful in Mexico. It attacked the Mexican port of Veracruz. The U.S. forces landed in Veracruz. Then they advanced towards the Mexican capital, Mexico City. In September 1847, a fierce battle broke out between the Americans and the Mexican troops to control a fort outside the city. Defending the castle is a memorable event in Mexican history. 5 young Mexican cadets fought the Americans to the end. They sacrificed their lives for their country. A 6th military cadet saw the Americans entering the fort. He wrapped the Mexican flag around his body and jumped down from the fort wall. He did this to protect his country's flag from the U.S. invaders. Today, these 6 military cadets are called the Children Heroes. When these cadets died, the Americans occupied the fort. When the Mexican forces in Mexico City heard the news, they evacuated the city. When the Mexican army retreated, the Americans waved their flag over Mexico City. When the U.S. troops occupied Mexico City, the Mexicans decided to end the war. They began talks for a ceasefire. On February 2, 1848, both countries signed a ceasefire deal. Mexico recognized Texas as part of the United States. It also gave more land to the United States. Mexico surrendered 1.3 million square kilometers of more area to the United States. But in this war, the Americans got another success that they had been waiting for since their independence. The United States got control of California. It meant they had now reached the shores of the Pacific Ocean. This was a journey of more than 4,000 kilometers from the East Coast to the West Coast. The United States had covered this distance within 72 years of its independence. The dream to make America a great power had finally come true. The United States now had access to 2 oceans. These oceans gave the United States access to 3 continents. Through the Atlantic Ocean in the east, the United States came closer to Europe and Africa, while through the Pacific Ocean in the west, it could easily reach Asia, China, and Japan. Interestingly, the United States gained land access to the Pacific Ocean not only from California, but also from the Oregon Country. In 1846, America signed a deal with Great Britain on the status of the Oregon Country. This deal ended the joint U.S.-British control over Oregon Territory. This area became part of the United States. From the current state of Washington to California, the entire Pacific coast was now part of the United States. Britain and Mexico had relinquished their claims over the coast. Ironically, after the annexation of Mexico, the United States paid $15 million to Mexico. America's first offer to Mexico for this territory was $30 million. But obviously, after the war, Mexico was not in a position to demand more money because it had lost the war. The United States returned some territory to Mexico, including its capital, Mexico City, but it deprived Mexico of its 1/3 territory on gunpoint. Now, a smaller Mexico was not a problem for the U.S. anymore. This was the successful planning of the American leaders. This planning helped the United States become a superpower. When Mexico was surrendering California to the United States for $15 million only, a carpenter, James Marshall, found $2 billion from a river in California. How did he do that? Look carefully at this wheel and planks. This is the place where the carpenter James was standing. The site was originally a wooden workshop, or a sawmill. This sawmill was operated with a force of water. James worked at this mill. On January 24th, 1848, James saw something shining in the river. He noticed there were small particles of gold that were scattered in the water. The news spread like wildfire from coast to coast in the United States. Millions of people from all over the United States moved to California to find gold. Everyone wanted gold. This period is called the Gold Rush in American history. At least 300,000 people from different parts of the United States settled in California during this period. The California Gold Rush lasted for at least 7 or 8 years. $2 billion worth of gold was mined from rivers. It looks that nature was also helping the U.S. in becoming a superpower, because this wealth supported the American economy. Now the U.S. could easily afford a large and powerful military force. Now the U.S. had taken California and Oregon territory. It had also reached the Pacific Ocean, but the American expansion did not stop on its western coast. Now the U.S. government planned to buy Alaska in western Canada. The area was at that time a Russian colony with a limited population. America had a solid reason to buy Alaska. Russia wanted to sell Alaska because it was worthless for it. The United States feared that Britain might buy the area. You have already known about the Monroe Doctrine. According to the doctrine, the United States did not want the European powers to get new lands in North and South America. So the U.S. government did not give the British any chance to buy Alaska. It offered to buy Alaska and make it part of the U.S. territory. The U.S. had already become a rich nation because of the gold rush. So a deal was signed in 1867. The U.S. paid Russia $7.2 million. Alaska's 1.5 square kilometers area became part of the United States under this deal. When Alaska joined the United States, the country's boundaries were now touching Asia, because only Bering Strait divided it from Asia. This was the same strait that had provided a land route to the first migrants from Asia to America. So now the U.S. borders had extended to the farthest corner of North America. But now the U.S. wanted to conquer oceans. It wanted to establish a powerful naval base in the Pacific Ocean. An ideal location lay for 000 km from the U.S. coast. This location was Hawaii Island, but it was not part of the U.S. Hawaii was a free and sovereign state at that time. Local tribes ruled over this land. The U.S. forced that state to allow a naval base. So it got permission to establish a naval base at Pearl Harbor. This is the same naval base that the Japanese targeted in World War II. So in 1887, the U.S. got permission to establish a naval base in Hawaii. Then the U.S. supported a rebellion in the state in 1893. The rebels overthrew the last queen of Hawaii. 7 years after this rebellion, the U.S. officially took over Hawaii. In this way, the 50-state America was formed, the United States of America. These 50 states are displayed on the American flag as stars. The Americans raised the same flag on the moon in 1969. So now this 50-state America was a powerful country. But as Mirza Ghalib said, a fault lies in my creation. The same thing happened with the U.S. In the 19th century, America was not only expanding, but also breaking from inside. One factor was destroying the United States. This factor started the Civil War in the mid-19th century. America broke into two parts. When a prisoner was taken to gallows, he had a paper in his hand. The old prisoner was hanged, but the writing on the paper was proven right. America's future was written on this paper. But what was actually written on this paper? What was the simple machine that enslaved millions of human beings? Which weapons changed the world's military doctrine forever? It was in America before the Civil War. Some soldiers were taking an old prisoner to gallows, but the prisoner was not afraid of death. He was so brave that he sat on his own coffin in the carriage. He was aware that he would be buried in the same coffin. When he came out of jail, he wrote something on a slip and gave it to the jailer. This writing was a prophecy, and this prophecy proved absolutely true. What did the prisoner write on the slip? Who was this old prisoner? I am Muhammad Osamagazi, and you are watching the History of America series on Daiko Sunojano. In this episode, you will watch the story of the American Civil War. This is the simple invention of history that divided America into two parts. This machine is a cotton gin that separates cotton and seeds from cotton flowers. It was widely used in America. This simple machine made white landlords billionaires in the southern states, because the southern states were the largest producers of cotton in the world. In those days, Europe had a booming textile industry. So the southern cotton-producing states had a simple money-making formula: more fields, more cotton, and more profits. They needed more slaves to work in the new cotton fields. Traders opened new markets to sell slaves to landlords. They sold slaves for $400 to $4,000. This inhumane trade was flourishing in America, especially in the southern states. The northern states were not major producers of cotton. The northern states were establishing industry. They did not need slaves. Most people in the North were not farmers. They were factory workers. Capitalists were opening more and more factories in those states. So the northern economy was not dependent upon slaves. White people thought if slaves worked in factories, then they would be jobless. That's why people in the northern states opposed slavery. Political movements and ideologues worked for the complete abolition of slavery. Opponents of slavery began to smuggle slaves from the southern states through secret routes. These secret routes were dubbed the Underground Railroad. Approximately 100,000 slaves used this network to flee from slavery. Slave owners suffered a loss of $50 million. Then a fight started between supporters and opponents of slavery because of an incident. Actually, the American Congress passed a controversial law. This law allowed the states to solve the issue of slavery by vote. States were given the authority to make slavery legal or illegal. This law is called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was a controversial law. Opponents of slavery did not accept it. Soon the supporters and opponents of this law started fighting with each other. Even Congress was turned into a battleground. A U.S. congressman tortured an anti-slavery senator inside the Congress. He almost killed the person with his cane. Then armed clashes also broke out between both groups in Kansas. Rioters set fire to homes, newspaper offices, and even hotels during the clashes. There was a man in Kansas who was planning something extraordinary. He was 59-year-old John Brown. He had a long white beard. Brown had taken part in the Kansas riots and killed many supporters of slavery. His comrades also called him Captain John Brown. He swore that he would end slavery by all means. Captain John Brown's plan was to loot a large weapons depot. He wanted to distribute these weapons among black slaves. In this way, he wanted to start a slave revolt. Brown soon found a cache of weapons for this purpose. A military depot was situated in Harper's Ferry, present-day West Virginia. 20,000 rifles were stored in this depot. Brown planned to loot the depot. On the night between the 16th and 17th of October, 1858, he attacked the depot. Brown and about 20 of his comrades entered the depot. Brown's force occupied the depot and took some people hostage. But his opponents also acted quickly. Townspeople and U.S. troops surrounded the warehouse. Both sides fired at each other the whole day. The next day, U.S. Marines attacked the depot and arrested Captain Brown. John Brown's 10 comrades, including his son, were killed in the fighting. Colonel Robert E. Lee was commanding these Marines. Robert Lee became the commander of the rebel states in the American Civil War. So, security forces had finally arrested John Brown. He was imprisoned in Charlestown, West Virginia. The court accused him of treason and rebellion. A jury sentenced him to death. On December 2nd, a jail guard took John Brown out of his prison to hang him in public. At that moment, John Brown handed his jailer a paper. He had predicted America's future on this paper. He wrote that the crimes of this guilty land would only be washed away with blood. He wrote that he believed this could be done without much bloodshed. But that belief was not true. Armed guards took John Brown to the gallows. They brought a horse-drawn carriage to take him to his final destination. They also placed his coffin in the carriage. His body would be buried in the same coffin. Brown sat on his own coffin without fear, and the carriage drove on. 1,000 American soldiers stood guard on either side of the gallows. There was so much security because John Brown had become the hero of the opponents of slavery. They were publishing advertisements asking all Christians to pray for John Brown. John Brown stepped out of the carriage and climbed the gallows without panic. He was calm and shook hands with the people there. He was as calm as if the execution was trivial to him. The area sheriff put a noose around his neck and a white hood over his face. Look at Brown's courage. To adjust the hood, Brown pulled a pin from his collar and gave it to the sheriff. The board was then pulled from under John Brown's feet. With the execution of John Brown, opponents of slavery found a martyr. They could now intensify their struggle on the basis of his legacy. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act did not only give a martyr to the Americans, but it also gave them their new president. This was President Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was not so popular with the American public in 1854, so he had little chance to become president. But because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln's luck began to rise. He challenged this act in public. He also delivered speeches against it. He also challenged Stephen Douglas, who supported the act, to debate. These debates took place, in which Lincoln defeated Douglas with his strong arguments. Because of his debates and speeches, Lincoln became very popular in the northern states. But these debates made him notorious in the southern states. For this reason, Lincoln became the presidential candidate of the Republican Party. Republican Party was formed in 1854. Many opponents of slavery had joined this party. When the party nominated Lincoln as its presidential candidate, the southern states were angry. People in the southern states knew that Lincoln was a staunch opponent of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They feared if he became president, he would abolish slavery. The southern states decided to leave the Union if Lincoln became president. They wanted a complete separation. Supporters of slavery were also leading a propaganda campaign against Lincoln in the southern states. Newspapers published cartoons against him. These cartoons showed Lincoln was riding on the shoulders of his party and blacks, and they were taking him to the White House. So, friends, in this situation, voting took place on November 6, 1860 in the United States. In the southern states, people hated Lincoln so much that they did not even print his name on the ballot paper. Undoubtedly, these were the most sensitive presidential elections in the entire U.S. history. Union of the country was at stake in these elections. It was clear that if Lincoln became president of the United States, the American Union would break up. Then the same thing happened. When the election results came out, Lincoln took the oath of the presidential office. 11 of America's 15 slave states seceded from the American Union. The rebel states created a new country. They called it the Confederate States of America. On February 18, 1861, Jefferson Davis took oath as the President of the Confederate States. Rebel states had made Richmond, Virginia, the capital of their new country. It was situated just 170 kilometers away from Washington. Abraham Lincoln was inexperienced when he took oath in March 1861. Yet, he faced a great challenge. But he did not let inexperience become his weakness or excuse. He wanted to reunite his country without bloodshed. But the very next month, in April, he was convinced that it was impossible to avoid bloodshed. In April 1861, the rebel states occupied an American Union base, Fort Sumner in South Carolina. This was the beginning of the American Civil War. So, John Brown's prophecy was fulfilled in this way. There was no other choice except to wash away the sins of the American soil with blood. Lincoln began to increase the numbers and power of the U.S. military. For this purpose, he used the resources of the free states. These states clearly outnumbered the rebel states. Before the war began, the U.S. military had only 16,000 troops. But over the next 5 years, that number rose to 1 million troops. In contrast, the rebel states were able to recruit only 500,000 troops. The Union forces and the rebels also tried to develop modern weapons. The Union Army produced machine guns while the rebels built submarines. Both weapons proved to be game changers in the post-Civil War era. These weapons changed the military doctrine forever. But these weapons were not widely used in the American Civil War. This war was fought mainly with old weapons and techniques. Lincoln commanded the Union Army to open several fronts against the rebels. The Union Navy also blocked rebel ports and captured few coastal areas. Lincoln's generals tried again and again to conquer Richmond, the rebel capital. But a rebel general foiled Lincoln's plans to conquer the city. The general's name was Robert E. Lee. General Lee had arrested John Brown. When the Civil War started, he resigned from the Union Army and joined the rebels. Until 1864, there were many ups and downs in the war. But the turning point came in 1864, when Lincoln sent another commander. He sent his commander-in-chief, General Grant, to conquer the rebel capital Richmond. Robert Lee's army began to lose after a long battle. They also used sophisticated combat techniques, but failed. Lee's army was exhausted because of the long war. It retreated after nearly a year-long battle. In any case, Lee's forces were fighting with fewer resources than the Union Army. Slave uprisings had also created problems for the rebel states. On the 18th of April, 1865, General Lee retreated from Pittsburgh. This city was situated near Richmond. 7 days after his retreat, he surrendered to General Grant. The Union flag was flown over Pittsburgh and Richmond once again. The United States became united again. John Brown's prediction came true 6 years later. The American Civil War ended after 4 years with the deaths of 600,000 people. Abraham Lincoln was the last person who gave his blood because of this war. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th at the Ford's Theater in Washington. It happened just 5 days after General Lee's surrender. Pro-rebel stage actor John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. A few days later, the U.S. troops tracked him and killed him in a gun battle. 4 of his accomplices were also arrested and hanged. Now Lincoln was dead. But before his assassination, he issued a decree that freed 4 million black slaves. After the Civil War, the United States became the richest nation on earth. Now it faced a new challenge. This new problem put a brake on the entire development of this richest nation. What was that challenge? America successfully conquered the land of the other countries. But one land got stuck in its throat. What was the story of this land? The story of the assassination of another American president will also be shown to you, but in the next episode of the same series. This is America. Here is Chicago's Haymarket, which made an epic. Now just look here. It is the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, and on this coast is the Elba-run town of the beautiful state of New Jersey. Here an American president standing on his principles breathed his last. What were the principles, and what history did the laborers make in the Haymarket? And which event in history made America a world military power? The period from the 1870s to the 1900s is called the Gilded Age of America. That is, a period of false glitter created by applying a gold coating. This Gilded Age term is often used derisively because it represented 2 faces of America. One image was of a dazzling development in which America seemed to thrive. In this image, the telephone had been invented and was being used. The streets of cities were lit up by electric lamps. People were seeing 4-wheel motors on the roads for the first time. Newspapers projected the experiences being done to invent the airplane. In this picture, America was actually becoming a technology nation as America's exports grew exponentially, and it increased to make America produce 30% of the world's products. Ingenuity and innovation made the U.S. the world's largest producer and exporter, and Britain, then a superpower, moved to second place in production. But it was just an image, and it had another picture behind it. This image was a stigmatized scene. The scene was the people and the foundations of this American glamour, and those who had founded this golden era and gave their sweat and blood means the workers were being exploited and oppressed. Some people sarcastically called it Gilded Age, i.e. age of cosmetic development, because the laborers, the real producers, earned hardly $1.50 a day. This amount was very scant if calculated at the current ratio of wages. So it made up a very small sum of money in a month. Because of this exploitation, the U.S. development at that time, and its top ranking in production stood on the exploitation of workers. Now, why was this exploitation happening? It had a weird reason. The reason was that in those days America had factories galore, so a majority of people was employed in those factories. A large number of Europeans would also come to the U.S. for better livelihood. These people were willing to work in the American factories at low wages, and for that matter, they were exploited by the capitalists. Because workers were plentiful, factory owners were free to hire and fire. So their labor was from 10 to 16 hours for daily wages of $1.50. The employers would boast of giving the workers 1 day weekly off. The scarce salary made workers unable to pay even the monthly house rent. This exploitation was going up openly, and the workers had no justice. It had a reason: that the American system responsible for justice had itself become corrupt. America's government institutions were corrupt. The U.S. politicians and officials would protect interests of capitalists for bribes. Due to the corruption, merit was not observed while recruiting public servants. But they would get the job on the principle of patronage or spoils system or booty. Now, what was the system? A popular slogan in America was that spoils, meaning booty, belonged to the victor. Based on this slogan, a system commonly called the spoils system was created. It meant a political party winning the polls would give jobs to its supporters only. That is, merit did not have any value in America. Recruitments were to be done on the political by the winning party. That is, the supporters of the party that wins the election will get government jobs. And everyone else, including the opposition, had only disappointment. The elected politicians would give jobs and privileges only to their favorites. They would turn a blind eye to their corruption as they were their supporters. The people recruited on political grounds later became the tools of the capitalists and helped the employers instead of stopping the exploitation of the workers. This was why there was a growing demand among the American people for immediate reforms in the government jobs, i.e. civil services. Reforms to stop capitalists and politicians from using the system in their interests. But the problem was that the politicians were the main beneficiary of the system. So how would they go for reforms? Eventually, a president came to power who did not care about political pressure and challenged the spoils system. The name of this president was James A. Garfield. Garfield became President of the United States in 1881. His government faced reforms in civil service as a challenge to check corruption. His priority was ending the spoils system and reforms in the civil service. So he refused to give jobs to his supporters on political grounds. Consequently, the opposition and men of his Republican Party turned against him. Republicans who favored jobs on political grounds were called stalwarts. So stalwarts opposed President Garfield when he refused jobs on a political basis. Senator Roscoe, who led the stalwarts, resigned in protest against Garfield. Now, there is a split in the Republican Party. Such a big rift and hatred that stalwarts decided to assassinate their president. Among President Garfield's supporters was a lawyer named Charles Gatto. This man was also a stalwart and aspired to a government job. But President Garfield refused him a job out of merit, which dejected Charles. The frustration led Charles to a fury where he planned to kill the president. First of all, Charles brought a revolver with an ivory handle. It was a British bulldog revolver. Charles presumed the revolver after the president's killing will grace a museum. Charles trained himself on the firing of this revolver for weeks. In those days, no special security for the American president was observed. The U.S. president moved in public with little security, so he was an easy target. During the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln also had light security. But after the Civil War, when his security was reduced, he was also killed. You can see the whole story in the interesting biography of Abraham Lincoln. Similarly, Garfield also did not carry security with him. Interestingly, Garfield once wrote that death may happen from murder and lightning, so escape from it is hard. So no need to worry too much about it. This laxity of President Garfield took him near death. On July 2nd, 1881, Garfield was at a railway station not far from the White House. This railway station no longer exists, and now the site has been occupied by buildings which were not in 1881. Garfield was going to the U.S. territory of New England to spend the summer, before he boarded the train. Assassin Charles shot him twice, aiming at his back. The first bullet just missed his right arm, but the second bullet went deep into his back. He was badly injured by this bullet. Charles tried to escape, but people around caught him and gave him to the police. The injured president was first taken to the White House, then Elba Run, New Jersey. There he remained between life and death for about 3 months. Despite the best efforts of the doctors, his wound continued to worsen, and he died at the end of September 1881. Newspapers announced his death on September 20th. The railway station where he was attacked is no more a rail station, but a golden star marked the incident as long as it existed. And at the place where he breathed his last, a memorial plaque stands today. After President Garfield's killing, cartoons of Charles appeared in the newspapers. Therein, he was shown outside the White House, holding a revolver and a poster. The poster displayed, "Will you give me a job or your life?" Some cartoons also depicted Charles as a clown or a jocker who trampled law and order and demanded a job. However, after Garfield's death, Charles was tried and sentenced to death. Garfield passed away before he could fix the American civil service, but his death did not go waste. After Garfield's death, the Americans opposed the spoils system so much that the U.S. government had no help but to abolish the system. After 2 years, in 1883, the U.S. Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act. The act wanted a civil service commission to test the candidates for jobs. The Pendleton Act proved the first drop against corruption in America. It was the first time merit-based civil servants were recruited to curb corruption. The U.S. public institutions we have today were founded by the Pendleton Act. Thus, Garfield sacrificed his life and began the end of the patronage system. Yet the public institutions still needed time to be completely purged of corruption. So, the exploitation of workers continued even after the Pendleton Civil Service Act. When the workers did not get political help, they decided to help themselves. They started movements against the capitalists, which had a center in the city of Chicago, 1,100 kilometers away from Washington. During the Gilded Age, from the 1870s to the 1900s, workers mainly demanded that their working hours should be reduced to 8 hours. For this, they started a movement across America, which was called the 8-Hour Day Movement. Chicago workers designed posters, held demonstrations, and raised their voices. This movement continued for nearly 2 decades, but the workers saw no results from this movement. Neither the capitalists nor the ruling class were ready to listen or accept them. So these workers now planned a big action. Among the leaders of these workers was a German immigrant, August Spies. He was a fiery orator and also published a newspaper, Arbeiterzeitung. His newspaper published articles in favor of workers. Apart from this, Spies were actively participating in the labor movement. Whenever he would sway the people emotionally when speaking. In April 1886, the Chicago workers announced that no workers would work until the 8-hour schedule was implemented. That means there will be a complete strike. As per the strike schedule, 35,000 workers went on strike in Chicago on May 1st. These workers went to every factory to persuade the workers to go on strike. Thus, the work in the factories was stopped. America's production machines slowed down and capitalist profits suffered. The factory owners bore all this patiently for 2 days, but on the 3rd day, they fired the striking workers and recruited new workers. Unemployment was also increasing in America in those days. Thousands of workers were available to fill the vacancy of one. So the factory owners started to find new workers instead of the striking ones. The owners of McCormick Wrapper Works in Chicago recruited new workers, and the factory, closed down due to the strike, began to reoperate. As the striking workers found instead of accepting their demands, they have lost jobs, they became furious. Suddenly, a procession of 3,000 workers moved toward the McCormick Reapers. This crowd was led by Spies and his associates. On reaching outside the factory, they saw gates locked and armed police deployed. When Spies saw the situation, he delivered an impassioned speech. This incited the workers so much that the workers stormed the factory in anger. They started to break open the gate and other parts of the factory. In response, The police also opened fire, and 6 laborers lost their lives. As bloodshed began, the crowd stepped back. After this tragedy, most of the workers went to their homes. But Spies did not go home, but went straight to his newspaper office. Here he published a pamphlet wherein he incited the workers to revenge, terming the policemen capitalist bloodhounds. He wrote for the workers that you endured humiliation and injustice for years, worked hard to death, suffered poverty and hunger, and sacrificed your children for the factory owners. But why? Is it for satisfying the greed of your lazy and thief masters? This pamphlet was published in both English and German. This pamphlet so inflamed the workers that they got ready for extreme measures. They planned to hold a meeting at Chicago's Haymarket the next day, May 4th. All workers were called to meet where vital decisions were to be taken. A poster published on May 4th stated that the meeting will be held at 7:30 tonight. The workers were asked to come armed and with full force at the meeting. However, some time after this poster, another poster was published in which the matter of being armed was erased. The Chicago situation was supercharged due to the McCormick factory incident. The workers were furious. The police also apprehended bloodshed if the meeting was stopped. So the city mayor allowed the meeting and stopped the police from interference. After these steps, the government felt workers' sentiments had been managed, but it was not the case. On May 4th, workers gathered at Haymarket. The stage built for the labor leaders was also a cart carrying hay. They would stand on it and speak. Today, right at the site, a memorial replicating that scene has been built, exactly at the same place. Today, a memorial of the hay cart stands, on which the labor leaders were making speeches against the police. They were in front of a sea of thousands of workers charged up against the police. The police were also present at some distance, but they were not interfering. The beloved labor leader, August Spies, was also there. Some outrageous people in the gathering were eager to take the policemen to task. They found it high time to settle the account with the policemen. They were also fully prepared to deal with the police. Here was a secret that very few of the people knew, that those who wanted to tackle the police had dynamites in their hands. The leaders were speaking, and the police stood quietly when an uproar erupted. The scene was created when a speaker became so fiery against the police that, in a rush of blood, he even said that now the law should be strangled, because no law was needed that shot the workers. On it, about 200 policemen asked the workers to end the meeting immediately. Seeing the advance of the police, the excited crowd broke out. This was the opportunity that some people might have been waiting for. Suddenly a bomb was hurled from the crowd at the police, and it exploded. There was an ear-deafening noise and a stampede. The police opened fire either out of desperation or to disperse the crowd. Police ran out of bullets, but stampede stayed, so they reloaded guns and fired. Some people from the crowd also opened fire on the police. This tumultuous situation lasted only 2 minutes. Within 2 minutes, the whole place was vacant. The situation left at least 7 policemen and 4 workers dead on the street, while the injured on both sides were in dozens. The game was over in 2 minutes, but the tragedy did not end. The police looked for the attacker who threw the first dynamite or bomb at them. The actual perpetrators were at large, but the police nabbed 8 people who were at the forefront of the labor movement. Among them was August Spies. These people were held responsible for the dynamite attack and tried. They were not found guilty, yet 4 labor leaders, including Spies, were hanged. Including Spies, 4 labor leaders were put to gallows. Of the rest 4, 1 committed suicide, and the sentence of 3 was pardoned. Spies and his 3 companions were buried in Forest Park Cemetery in Chicago. The Haymarket Martyrs Monument was built on their graves, which may be called monument in the memory of the martyrs of Haymarket. The monument depicts a woman standing in front of a fallen laborer, apparently trying to resist police fire. The dead August Spies left a historical phrase still inscribed on this monument. It states a day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices. You are trying to suppress today? Spies proved true. The U.S. police and the capitalists could not silence the workers. The unabated labor movement 30 years later got workers' main demand accepted. In 1916, the U.S. government passed a law called the Adamson Act. Under this law, The daily working time of railway workers was fixed at 8 hours. Soon after, workers in other companies also got the right to work for 8 hours. The struggle of the workers succeeded after many lives and decades of effort. Workers won the battle for their demands, but they did not forget the May 4th tragedy. This atrocious accident on the workers is remembered on May 1st as Labor Day. Despite this tragedy, the Gilded Age from the 1870s to the 1990s ended in a war. The third episode of Season 2 of History of America showed the Monroe Doctrine, through which the U.S. halted European interference in North and South America. In 1898, the U.S. attacked a neighboring country under the Monroe Doctrine. This U.S. aggression hugely enabled it to become a superpower and military might. But what was this jump? Under the U.S. state of Florida is the state of Cuba with two big islands. Cuba had been a colony of Spain since the time of Columbus, for almost 400 years. But in 1895, the independence movement started there. The natives started fighting the Spanish army to leave their territory. Now clashes between the Spanish army and the rebels took place. The clashes worried the U.S. as it had invested $50 million in Cuba. Besides that, the U.S. and Cuba had a trade of tens of millions of dollars. But the fight in Cuba was destroying both U.S. trade and investment. So America decided to become a party instead of posing neutrality. The U.S. media and public siding with the Cuban rebels urged their government to intervene in Cuba and free the Cubans. Under this pressure, or in its own interests, the United States sent a warship, the USS Maine, to the port of Havana, the capital of Cuba. The U.S. pretended the warship was sent to protect Americans and their property. As the ship arrived at the port of Havana, a huge stone naturally rolled out. On the night of February 15, 1898, when the U.S. ship crew was asleep, ship suddenly had a doomsday. A terrible explosion set the ship on fire. Whether it was a torpedo fired at the ship or something else no one knew, the onlookers saw fire in the water and the crew diving into the sea for their lives. 260 of the nearly 400 crew members lost their lives in this incident. However, the rest, including the ship's captain, survived. Although it took a long time for the ship to sink completely into the sea, it was so badly damaged that any attempt to save it was futile. The ship captain immediately sent a telegram to America to report the incident. When the news reached America, there was chaos there. The news hit banner lines in American newspapers, and Spain was held to cheat. The Evening Times wrote that the USS Maine was destroyed by Spain. The newspaper quoted the ship's captain, Sigsbee, as saying that all evidence points to the ship being hit by a torpedo. The Daily wrote sharks have eaten 250 Americans, and it is an issue of patriotism. The newspapers created an atmosphere to fan sentiments of revenge on Spain. A Daily published a caricature that a U.S. ship bombing Spain's Emperor Alfonso, and on the bomb was written retribution, meaning revenge, while the emperor is playing with a toy boat in Cuba before the bomb came, to seek war and mobilize the public to it. The dailies also used the slogan, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," meaning forget Spain, remember Shipman. The U.S. and the public voiced revenge that was to benefit the establishment directly. The American government established a commission to probe ship destruction. In a report after a month, it accused Spain of attacking the U.S. ship. The government of Spain did not accept this claim of the United States and offered to have the incident investigated by a neutral country. For humanity, the UK, France, and Russia asked U.S. President William McKinley not to intervene in Cuba. The U.S. president replied their intervention would be in the interest of humanity. The head of the Catholic Church, Pope Leo XIII, also offered mediation. But under the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. viewed Spain as an adversary in Cuba. America viewed that Spain must be expelled from Cuba by force. So it turned down all appeals and mediation offers for not going to war and took the extreme step on April 20th. The U.S. Congress demanded Spain to pull out troops from Cuba and give it freedom. The Congress also authorized U.S. President William McKinley to use the U.S. Army or Navy to implement the demands of Congress. This declaration of the U.S. Congress was an open interference in the affairs of Spain. This declaration pushed Spain to a dead end. Now Spain had no choice but war with America. So on April 24th, it declared war against America. The next day, on April 25th, the American Congress also declared war against Spain. The American fleet attacked 4 Spanish colonies. 2 were Cuba and Puerto Rico, and the other 2 were the Philippines and Guam. The Spanish forces at all 4 could not withstand against Americans, and were defeated without significant resistance. The U.S. captured Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam in this campaign. In 1898, under the Treaty of Paris, Spain withdrew claims on these 4 colonies. Under the treaty, the United States also paid Spain $20 million for infrastructure that Spain had built in those territories. What happened next? For years after, of all 4, Cuba was given independence by the U.S. in 1922. In the remaining 3 colonies, the U.S. maintained its hold. 2 islands, Guam and Puerto Rico, are still occupied by the United States. After Spain had left, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam proved no problem for America. But this was not the case about the Philippines. The occupation of the Philippines became a constant irritation for the United States. The Filipinos rejected the U.S. occupation and started the War of Independence. This battle continued till 1902. Over 4,000 U.S. soldiers and 20,000 Filipino freedom fighters were killed in this battle. The Americans also killed innumerable civilians who were not involved in the fight. At the end of the 19th century, the battle between the workers and capitalists reached the door of the White House. The capitalists wanted a strong grip on the strongest presidential office in America, and the working class wanted to see such a person leading America who would protect their rights. So the working class began to support a person against the capitalists who spoke for them. The arrival of this workers-friendly Democratic leader turned the U.S. election into a battlefield. Who won this historic, adventurous election of America? Who and how freed America from the clutches of the business class when it strongly gripped every inch of it? The story of the same milestone in America. It was 1896 when preparations for election in America were on. Elections in America are held every 4 years, but elections in 1896 were somewhat special. It was the fact that 2 potential candidates were apparently in the arena, but factually it was not a contest between them. It was a fight between their supporters or those who fielded them. The election contest was between a handful of strong American capitalists and the suppressed majority working class. The result had to determine whether American rule would stay in the hands of the rich class or something will happen, and the spell of these monopolizing Americans will be broken or not. The Americans, particularly workers, were sick of the slavery of the capitalists. America was at that crossroads of history where 3 leading capitalists, namely John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J. P. Morgan, had taken hostage the entire American economy and society. The 90% oil business in America was in control of the company owned by John Rockefeller. In particular, Rockefeller had established a 100% monopoly in kerosene oil, which was generally used in lighting lamps. He had laid out over a 6,000 kilometers long pipeline for the supply of oil. The companies of Rockefeller had over 100,000 workers. The steel industry was in the iron hand of the second businessman, Andrew Carnegie. His Carnegie Steel Company supplied steel in the construction of bridges, buildings, and factories all over America. J. P. Morgan was an investor who put money into every business in the USA, from power generation to railway, shipping, etc. Then he was a billionaire, and it was impossible to challenge his monopoly. The people even used to say that the American economy is not run by the government, but by J. P. Morgan. We have shown you that J. P. Morgan was the major investor of the eminent inventor Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. So much so that he also invested in the manufacturing of the world-renowned Titan ship. In short, these 3 people were direct and indirect carte blanche of America due to their riches. The total volume of the wealth of those 3, as per the current estimate, was over $1 trillion. It was such a huge amount that the total of those 40 richest persons today did not match them. Now these capitalists had become so powerful that they had divided America as per their choice. The investors group backed by them monopolized every business in America, and the group was named Trust. These trusts would erect their business empire on the blood and sweat of the workers. They would pay only $1.50 daily each to workers and digest the rest of their wages and toil. These trusts had become so powerful that people would think they were real rulers of America. For example, Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust was dubbed by the U.S. media as Monster Monopoly. This trust was shown as an octopus. In cartoons, it was shown that Standard Oil or the octopus had spread its tentacles in banking, shipping, electricity, insurance, railways, and even the White House. The horrible monopoly of these capitalists resulted in zero chance of competition for the new businessmen in America. No one could stand against the giant business concerns. When any investor entered the business, these monopolists would cart a lease to throw this new competitor out. Control over price was the strongest weapon in their hand. The monopolists would use this tool to fluctuate rates in their favor and against a newcomer. It would sink the investment and business of the newcomers. Hence, the monopolists had permanently blocked the avenue of perfect completion in America. For the transportation of oil in America, the railway was a means at that time. Rockefeller, the biggest oil investor, through dealing underhand at the rail company, would get a discount on cargo. His oil was charged cargo at a cheap rate against the high rates charged from his competitor companies. So those already small business concerns faced problems as their oil failed to hit the market due to high prices. Consequently, the small companies would go bankrupt, and they would leave with the only option to sell their refineries to Rockefeller at throwaway prices and go out of the business. In 1871, John Rockefeller inked a deal with a rail company for this purpose. This resulted in the bankruptcy of several companies whose owners were obliged to sell out their refineries to Rockefeller at throwaway prices to meet their deficits. Thus, only in a year, Rockefeller devoured the 20 oil refineries, which once formed 25% of the American oil industry. It was just to illustrate how the American monopolists enhanced their wealth and power by destroying the businesses of others. Monopolist investors were complacent as no one could challenge them. But in 1896, the situation changed. William Jennings Bryan, a congressman from the state of Nebraska, challenged the monopoly of investors. William Bryan Dorn was such a good orator, and his impassioned speeches would enthrall the listeners. And the most glaring part was that his words echoed the sentiments of the workers. Including Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, he named major investors in his speeches and challenged them. He even claimed to put the monopolists and capitalists in jail when he came into power. Bryan Dorn's fervency, thoughts, and fame attracted the working class to the extent of thinking of him as its messiah. So in 1896, the Democratic Party, in its convention in Chicago, nominated him its presidential candidate. The investors got badly frightened by the announcement of his presidential candidature. They knew that as Bryan won the polls, their monopoly would be jeopardized. Therefore, in every condition, their supporters must be in the White House. So on behalf of the Republican Party, they decided to bring their own candidate against Bryan Dorn. This candidate was William McKinley, who was the governor of Ohio before the presidential candidacy. As such, he was not a novice for the Americans. The capitalists entered a secret deal with McKinley to save their monopoly and crowned him with presidential candidature. Both candidates would run their election campaign, in which Bryan Dorn relied on public power, as his narrative reciprocated public thought, and was popular. As such, he was sure of getting a majority vote for him. Bryan Dorn had a comprehensive campaign with an aim to get closest to the masses. He traveled in a train to 27 American states, covering a distance of 29,000 kilometers, and addressed the public. He made fiery speeches in difference, and a huge public gathered to receive him. The campaign of Bryan Dorn was based on the pledge to raise workers' salaries and lawmaking for conducive working conditions. His opponent, William McKinley, did not even come out of his house in Ohio and stayed enjoying the weather wearing a cowboy hat. Even if he were to address the public, he would do it standing on the rooftop or balcony of his house. He did not go out to party meetings and would hold table meeting at home. The newspapers would also satire McKinley for the sake of protection against attacks of populist politics and to solve currency problems. Has so much engagement that he did not have time to talk to people. He was doing all this because the American business establishment was with him. The monopolist capitalists across America were themselves running his campaign through their treasures. On McKinley's campaign, These capitalists spent $4 million against just $300,000 that Dorn could raise for his campaign. McKinley's capitalist supporters also printed 250 million propaganda pamphlets. These pamphlets were delivered through DAC to every house in America. Against this VVIP election campaign, the workers' leader Brian Dorn had almost negligible posters and pamphlets. The monopolist capitalists were so shrewd that in order to project a good image of the stooge McKinley, they also put a huge amount of money into the media. To portray McKinley as a good reputed and Brian Dorn as ill reputed, they fed newspapers with dollars. They got printed caricatures to portray Brian Dorn speaking, like a monkey, to make McKinley morally heavyweight. It purported to show that McKinley was not even running his election campaign. Since McKinley did not speak, therefore his face was saved by that means. Cartoons were also published showing Brian Dorn like a dragon, swallowing down his party symbol, donkey. Sometimes Brian Dorn's campaign at the railway was ridiculed that he was selling false hopes to the public, and the beggary-inflicted people are swimming their heads with joy. Brian Dorn wanted silver coins also to be released with the golden ones in American currency, so that control could be maintained on the value of the currency. On it, a daily published a cartoon to show Brian Dorn being used like a puppet by the owners of the silver mines. And he is continuing to harp on the tune of prosperity before the poor workers. Passing this propaganda and heated campaign approached Election Day. On November 3, 1896 polls were to be held. The capitalists before voting played a decisive move. The move proved fatal for Brian Dorn. The capitalists made a weird announcement and told millions of workers in their factories that if Brian won, you need not come to the job from tomorrow, as there will be no business after that. So if Brian wins on Election Tuesday, do a bar to show for work on the next day, as there will be no jobs. This announcement was no less than a threat to the workers. Now, poor workers wavered between voting Brian to victory or thinking about their sustenance. In the battle between ideology and the stomach, the latter won. The result was the same as the monopolist capitalists wished. William McKinley secured over 7.1 million popular votes and 271 electoral seats and won the elections. Brian Dorn secured 6.5 million votes and 176 electoral seats. Thus the capitalists succeeded in bringing their stooge, their own man, to the White House. The working class had long faces because they were going to have the worst. After taking over, William McKinley did the same what the capitalists desired. He did not act against the rich businessmen who took part in running his election campaign. These businessmen continued to take prices up and down, and McKinley turned a blind eye to them. Rather, he liberally granted to his supporters after taking over president. All offices and privileges were put before them. The capitalist did not have any worries during his first term. You learned from the last video that it was McKinley who fought Spain and captured Cuba and the Philippines. Such wars are declared by the president who wants to cover up his wrongdoings. So he also stirred conflict. In 1900, he also sent his troops to China during the Boxer Rebellion. These troops went to Beijing, then called Peking. A detailed story of this incident has been shown to you in the History of China series. Here it is worth noting that then the American Army was a part of the World Alliance which occupied Beijing, and there it had served to protect world diplomatic staff. From 1896 to 1900, McKinley held the American presidentship. He was re-elected as president in 1900. Interestingly, this time, too, Brian Dorn was fielded candidate of the Democratic Party against him, but he was defeated again. Notably, in the election 1900, Brian Dorn did not command the popularity of the past election. Neither the capitalists were much worried about him, because this time they had new cause to be worried about. This was Theodore Roosevelt, who was the governor of the state of New York. Theodore Roosevelt had commanded the American troops in the war against Spain. He was acknowledged as a hero among the Americans. He had so much support in the Republican Party that he might also become a presidential candidate, which means bypassing McKinley. He was also like McKinley from the Republicans, yet Roosevelt was dead opposed to the monopoly of the capitalists. Therefore, his popularity was an alarm bell for the monopolists. In Roosevelt's view, it was the worst in America that a small business class had become exceptionally powerful. He believed in giving equal opportunities for business to everyone in America. The term American Dream also meant equal rights and opportunities for business and development for everyone. Roosevelt believed the ideas of the monopolist capitalists negated the American dream, and he wanted to end this monopoly. The capitalists saw through the intentions of Roosevelt and played a unique trick, a trick which has to succeed them without causing harm. Instead of nominating Roosevelt as a presidential candidate, the capitalists asked McKinley to fight for the next term as well, and appoint Roosevelt as his vice president. The vice president meant that Roosevelt would be without any authority and every power with President McKinley. So McKinley nominated Roosevelt as a candidate for the vice president slot in the election of 1900. Byron Dorn again failed in the election as per the expectations of the capitalists, and McKinley kept control over the White House. Theodore Roosevelt was made the vice president. Everything was going perfectly as per the scheme of the capitalists. They played well and sidelined Roosevelt. But you know the variables of the time and age are so many that no one can work them out. Therefore, no one can predict 100% exactly about the future till the date. So such a variable put them in the troubled water. What was that variable? On September 6, 1901, a Polish Leon Czolgosz shot a fire at President McKinley in the New York City of Buffalo. He was a worker who believed McKinley's government was anti-workers and a supporter of the capitalists. So he attacked the president when he was among the common people. He concealed a revolver under a handkerchief and fired 2 shots at the president. The incident injured the president seriously, who went through life and death for 8 days and died ultimately on September 14th. The murderer was executed by electrocution in the death chair. In his last words, he said, "He killed McKinley for the good of the laborers, so he has no regrets." The murderer met his end, and with it, the challenger of capitalists, Roosevelt, was elevated as American president. Roosevelt stayed the American president till 2009. First time in American history, what happened during his tenure was unprecedented. He initiated to end the monopoly of the capitalists and put all giant capitalists on his hit list. The presidency of Roosevelt was a nightmare for the capitalists John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J. P. Morgan. Carnegie was lucky that when Roosevelt became president in 1901, he sold out his steel company to Morgan for $480 million. Thus he escaped the actions of Roosevelt, but Rockefeller and Morgan fell as victims. Roosevelt initiated action against Rockefeller and Morgan under a law which was passed in 1890. But the law had not been acted upon accordingly so far. This law was the Sherman Antitrust, which held as a crime the Monopoly Trust Act of price determination, reducing industrial production, blocking competition, and sharing the market. Roosevelt employing the same law-registered cases against 40 major corporations of the trusts of Rockefeller and Morgan. These cases were a milestone in American history. Morgan's Northern Security Company, which controlled the railway tracks, became the first target of those cases. Roosevelt declared unlawful the monopoly of this company. The case reached the Supreme Court, which in 1904 decided against the Northern Security Company and ended its monopoly. Then this company was dissolved and devolved into multiple small companies. This is a famous case in American history, which earned the title of Trust Burster for Roosevelt. After Northern Security Company was the Standard Oil of the richest man in human history, John Rockefeller. Roosevelt also instituted a case against Standard Oil in 1906. The case proceeded till 1911 and resulted in the same fate as that of the Northern Security. Standard Oil was divided into 34 small companies, and its monopoly was abolished. The period of Theodore Roosevelt was the most significant in American history in terms of ending monopolies of major companies and businesses based on competition started in America. Credit goes to Roosevelt for whatever business facilities are available in America today, because he had revived the American dream. President Theodore Roosevelt, as trust burster, broke the monopoly of the capitalists and also broke a country to dig out a canal. Do you know how the Panama Canal in Panama came into being? Why did America and the world capitalists want to build the Panama Canal? What did America do when it wanted to create political chaos in the country? America willingly entered the First World War, or a conspiracy dragged it in, will be shown you